So we've discussed how grammar is not the way we need to look at language if we're going to help our children acquire it or have it in their minds. What do we need to do? What do we need to focus on? What are best practices to drive acquisition? And something that you might be familiar with, maybe not, is a term called input. And it is essentially any language that a student is exposed to, either written or spoken, in their environment. And input is absolutely essential for anyone to acquire a language. They have to have the language around them. They have to be submersed in it if they want to acquire it. And some would argue that that's not sufficient. It's not sufficient to just have input in your environment. Some would argue it is. But that aside, there is a step process that always begins with input that people who acquire languages follow. And it starts with input, and then it goes to intake, and then it goes to a developing system, and then finally output. So we're going to touch on each one of those very briefly, and then we'll go from there. So input, as I mentioned, is any language that a student is exposed to. Intake is what the student notices and or retains about the language. And then developing system is what the student believes to be true about the language systematically based on the language that they have observed and heard and taken in. And then finally, once they have a developing system based on what they've seen, heard, noticed, developed, put into place, organized, then they can start to output. They can start to produce the language themselves. So let's just take that in for a minute. That's a lot of information. Traditional language classrooms are focused on exercises, drills, information, grammar, because they are focused on that last step, the output. They think we need to get them to output, 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 because that's also what they feel like they can measure. They say, what can they output? That's what we can say. You can say a phrase, you can, make a speech, what have you, but when it's all is said and done, if anyone wants to spontaneously produce a language, if they want to spontaneously output a language in a meaningful way, they have to follow that process. There's no way of getting around it. Input, intake, developing system, and output. And when we focus on that input, we really set our children up for success when it comes to being able to then notice things about the language, develop an understanding of it that is their own based on what they've observed, and then with time and with a little bit of patience, possibly being able to produce. And again, the production is not going to be perfect right off the bat. In fact, a little anecdote, my 3-year-old daughter was walking around and she saw something that her brother was doing to her younger sister and said, I want he to do that to me. Well, if we're in an output-focused classroom, let's say an older child said something like that in their second language, that's incorrect, that's wrong. But really, what that's exposing to me is that she understands in her developing system of the English language, her first language, that he can be used in that instead of him. I want him to do that to me, but it should say, I want he to do that to me. It's not incorrect if you're measuring it against her system that she has in her mind of the language. So essentially, what we really want to do is we want to take pressure off of children to output perfectly by focusing on the input that they're receiving, making sure that it's clear, that it's meaningful. And we're going to talk about all the different components of input that make it most effective to set children up for success in acquiring.